Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this active presentation of the book Defensa de la Vivienda. We have with us one of his authors. I don't know if we should. It's common, but I would like to thank Captain Swing, the publishers, and the great work that they have been doing, showing books that were.
Cuando pensaba en que nos reúne, se me agolpaba
When I had
pasada.
in this,
En torno a Chavo.
yo cuando salto no oigo nada. O sea, cuando doy al micro no.
Que dominan imponentes el horizonte en determinados barrios y que entre
from the skeletons of abandoned houses that were never finished because a bubble came in their way, the bricks and metal panels that lock out the windows of many houses in abandoned neighborhoods. These houses, we are reminded, that are no more a place to live in. There are many overcrowded neighborhoods, and there are wide avenues in the new urban planning that have been planned around closed condos, and people have given up getting in touch to others. I was remembering black and white photographs around small houses that requested a dignified way of living. And when the last bubble started to blow a decade ago, we were reminded that we would never have another house. And nowadays, we see groups of women looking straight ahead and facing the fighting for the future, and we are reminded of the new social fights of our times. And at the same time, that we see many books that are dealing with the problem with housing in the past and the present, there are very few books that deal with the fights of the past and the present. These are written in a good language, in a simple language, and Madden and Marcus' books gives us new fundamental concepts that allow us to insert the problem of housing in the political dimension that tells us about the structural problem of the housing issue. It's not the crisis, it's a system, said one of the slogans from the 15th of March. And Madden explains it very well. We are facing one of the unavoidable issues of a model. When we talk about the political aspect of housing, requires thinking about housing as a political issue. It's an element to oppress certain social groups that crosses poverty, gender, and race aspects. And we are forced to deal with housing aspects as a guarantee as a warrant of social stability for a wider group of population. To deal with the political dimension of housing forces us to think of housing as a part of a puzzle to create a social structure that connects the social tissue and establishes a determined society, a particular society that has social inequality as an axe, and where the two different worlds are completely opposed. And in face of this reality, Madden talks us about the demands around the housing. We are concerned about the transformative demands. These demands try to face and tackle the systemic causes of the injustice and inequalities, and to deal with the root causes of the systemic factors of this that Madden says about the transformative demands could be applied elsewhere. We could say that this book is a transformative book that allows us to create a new, different world. Madden, who's here today with us, is an associate professor in the sociology department and city programs in the London School of Economics. He works in urban planning, political sociology. He has directed researches dealing with population sociology, etc., in New York and London, in other cities, dealing with subjects as the public space, the centrification, and his work that has a great dissemination among the academic world is also very well known for the general public. And today, as I was saying at the beginning, we are lucky enough to have him with us in order for him to introduce this great book dealing with housing.
Thank you all so much for coming here. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. That was very generous and kind. And thank you to Blanca and Capitan Swing for organizing this, and to the Fundación Telefónica for having me here. This is great, so thank you so much. It is great to see everyone here interested in this issue that affects all of us and that we're all aware about. And what we're trying to do on the basic level when we were writing this book is try to find a more critical political language in order to talk about the housing problem, in order to understand housing politics. We noticed that the public discussion about housing tends to stay within fairly narrow terms that don't speak to the experience of crisis that so many households are undergoing. So we wanted to move past the ideological simplifications about housing and develop a much more critical way to think about it and to talk about it. And as Deborah said, if there's any core argument to this book, it's that housing's function as real estate has come to dominate all the other aspects of housing. We don't build and develop housing in order for living now. We build and develop housing in order for it to function as a commodity, as an object of speculation and of financialization, and that is the core of the problem. What we're experiencing is not the system breaking down, but the system working as it is intended. So in order to... sorry. Thank you. Is that better? Hopefully you can hear me now. If we want to address the global housing crisis, then we need to change the housing system as it exists. We can't just tinker around the edges and make small changes. There needs to be a different housing system. This is not to say that we want to make the debate about housing narrowly economistic. We argued that when we talk about housing, we are always going to be talking about so many things. Housing is not only about housing. Housing is always about politics, about power, about exploitation, about alienation, about patriarchy, about racism, about so much. So we want to find a better way to talk about the politics of housing in appropriately broad terms. So let me briefly touch upon 6 points that appear in the book, and hopefully I'll stay within the allotted time. So first, we argue that we need to be careful in the way that we define the housing problem. We're actually quite skeptical of the idea of a housing crisis because it implies that there's a temporary problem and that if we could just return to the status quo, then everything will be fine. When in reality, it is the status quo that is the problem. And for working class and poor people especially, housing has always been in crisis. We talk about housing crisis in cities like London and New York and many other places now because it is impacting middle-class families, but it's possible for the idea of housing crisis to obscure the fact that there are certain groups in society that have been living in poor housing conditions for quite a long time. Ultimately, we stick with this idea of crisis because it connects the experience of individual and family level crisis that people are undergoing with the broader systemic issues that we're trying to highlight. But we do think that it's important to be careful and to accurately define the problem. Second, in order to better define the housing problem, we start from the position that the residential is political, that the housing system reflects fundamental antagonisms and inequalities in class society. So that's why narrow technical solutions like tweaking zoning law or making slight alterations in mortgage lending rules are not going to solve the problem. I mean, ultimately, we have a housing problem now because some people are benefiting from it, while others are suffering. So housing will always be political. The idea is not to sort of get politics out of housing, but it's rather to ask how can we use the housing system as an instrument for justice and equality instead of an instrument to amplify market inequalities. How can housing become an instrument for redistribution that it had been in some places and times? Third, we argue that the driving force of the housing problem is commodification, the way that housing has become a globally circulating liquid financial instrument. And our argument is that while there was never a period in the history of capitalist cities that the housing problem was solved, the commodity character of housing is variable. It rises and falls and takes a different shape and acquires a different extent in different times and places. We're currently in a position where the commodity character of housing is being expanded, where the function of housing as real estate is coming to take precedence over all the other dimensions of housing. But it doesn't have to be this way. And the extent to which housing has been financialized and commodified has changed throughout history. And we can find ways to change it again. Fourth, we argue that we need to understand the consequences of commodification and financialization within the housing sphere. So if you walk around most big cities in really anywhere in the world, you can see a certain type of example of deeply commodified housing. You can see buildings that were built purely as investment vehicles, housing units that were never meant really to be occupied and just are intended as tokens of exchange among global elites. That's one example of how the commodification of housing is reshaping our cities. But it's not only a matter of luxury housing and of very expensive housing. It's very important to understand how the financialization of housing is reshaping the housing scape for working class and poor and middle class households as well. There are new forms of institutional landlords. There are new patterns of property ownership. There's a whole new class of financial actors, of investors, of corporations, of equity firms that are involved in housing as a result of this process of financialization and of commodification. And again, this process is historically unprecedented. Through most of the modern history of housing, you have not had these types of firms owning housing in this way. In fact, these types of firms have never really existed throughout the history of modern capitalism. So it's important, again, to understand that this is a historically specific moment and one that is shaped by state action and by policy. Fifth, we argue that the story isn't completely grim because there are forces within the housing system that are working to transform it. So we are living in an era of very important housing movements. I mean, there are famous ones across the world, such as Abalali Bassam Jondolo in Durban in South Africa, Focus E15 in London, and of course the PA and many other famous groups here in Spain. These are the groups that are organizing in defense of housing. These are the groups that are trying to defend housing as lived social space, to defend housing in the name of those who inhabit housing, people who use it for dwelling, as opposed to the investors who see housing as a tool for profit, or the technocrat who sees housing as an instrument for social control. These housing movements are as much a feature of the contemporary housing system as is global finance. And I think in the current climate, when public anger is a potent political force, housing movements can be crucial political actors and can really shape the public agenda in a deeper way. I don't think it's at all a stretch to say that housing insecurity and precarity is reshaping politics on a large scale. And if movements and political groups can seize this as an issue and frame it accurately, I think a lot of things that currently seem impossible in politics would become possible. Ultimately, finally, we argue for a radical right to housing. And we argue that it's not enough to say there needs to be a right to housing, because there is a right to housing in many places. In the Constitution of Spain, in the Constitution of dozens of other countries, in the International Declaration of Human Rights, and in many international treaties that most countries have signed on to, they have established a right to housing. And if you ask most political parties and most people, they will say they support the idea that everyone should have housing, that housing should not be purely dependent upon market allocation, and that they agree with the goal of universal housing for all. So we're actually in a situation where the right to housing coexists with huge housing injustice and huge housing inequality. So like all rights, it is a matter of how it is interpreted and institutionalized. So a formal right to housing, a purely formal right to housing, is compatible with housing inequality. So we argue that there needs to be a deeper right to housing, that the idea of a radical right to housing means the imperative to transform the housing system, to make it more democratic, to decommodify it, to find ways to move past the residential alienation that so many households experience today. So if the radical right to housing means anything, it needs to be the name of a movement and a political project, a sort of species of politics, if you will, not a formal, not only a formal legalistic right. Ultimately, there is no magic formula to solving the housing crisis. There's not one policy that is going to change things. The idea of a right to housing names a direction, not a solution. The only solution is to mobilize and to struggle to make that right a reality. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, David.
Thank you, David, for your effort for summarizing and clarifying, and to try and summarize in just 10 minutes all the folds of such a complex book is very difficult. Now we are going to start a second part of these events where we will be having a debate. Obviously, David Madden is also going to be here with us, but we will also have Javier Gil, who is studying a PhD in the remote study university, and he's doing studies on housing. We will also have with us Raquel Rodriguez, who is an urban planner and architect. She is professor in one of the programs and one of the departments of territory and tourism in the Polytechnica University of Madrid. And we also have Mercedes Revuelta. She is many things in life, of course, but she wanted to highlight here her activism with the PA platform. Each of the speakers will present a short presentation, and then we will have a debate. There's also a Q&A time, so you can participate. Both those of you who are here and those who are following this event by streaming, you can use our hashtag, and we will gather your questions. The hashtag is En Defensa de la Vivienda. So please join us on the stage. Javier, Mercedes, David. Would you like to start, Javier?
Good morning, all. I would like to thank you for your invitation. And when you invited me to participate in the event, I would like to tell you what I felt when I read the book. It was quite a useful book, because with everything that is going on right now here in Spain, is that with the whole theoretical analysis and all the cases that are shown, the first thing that was inspired is we are living a new class fight that now is articulated on housing. So what helped me a lot to understand, especially in the Spanish context, but of course the Spanish one is part of the one that is being developed at the international level, the question I was asking myself is, how is this class struggle being configured? What political factors have an influence? Because as David mentioned, and is quite well described in the book, this is not the natural evolution of the market. When someone has a rise on rent of 40%, when some laws are adopted and other ones are not, things that are happening with housing in the country now is because of political issues. Because in Spain, rents are increasing in an average of 40% after the crash of 2008. And also the possibility of this being able to be changed is part of a political decision. Therefore, the political decisions have an influence. And from a political point of view, we can reverse the real estate bubble, which is not like a weather thing. When you think that the real estate bubble is like a weather thing, you cannot do anything. You can just protect yourself. So rain will affect you as least as possible. But when it's a political one, they raise my rent, they put me on the street, I'm going to assume it in the best possible way. That's not the way it is. This is a political thing. It's not natural. I'm not going to take it, and I'm going to resist, and I'm going to do something about it. And we have organizations like PA in Spain who are being organized, and one of the largest campaigns they have is the campaign of We Stay, Nos Quedamos. When your rent contract is not renewed because they're going to increase 30, 40, 300%, as Deborah was saying, families say, we stay, we keep on paying what we were paying before. So we have to disobey some laws, as PA has been doing for 10 years, so we guarantee the Constitution. As David was saying, it's amazing what the Spanish Constitution is saying and what public powers should do. So Article 47 of the Constitution is fulfilled, and that crosses with the housing policy that is being developed in the last 30 years. But let's focus on the new cycle, which not only breached that article, but actually they're doing the opposite of those constitution articles, like the Madrid autonomous region that right now doesn't have an autonomous law of housing. So how this class struggle happens is the social function of housing as a household with people live, and the economic part as real estate, and this is quite mentioned in the book. And this antagonism is not between a social and economic, but between a social and speculation thing. The type of investment that is happening in Spain is not addressed like on the entrepreneurial sector in Germany, that I invest in housing, and what I do is household to state 15, 20 years, because as far as they pay is good enough. I don't want to have them on arrears. It's just a speculation, and every 3 years I'm going to kick the tenants out. I'm going to get new ones paying more to have more and more money out of that housing because I'm increasing rent. Yesterday there was an article in the press saying that banks are already given a lot of credit, a housing of credit. So we went with the rent bubble politically created was good enough to provide more value for the housing and to generate a situation where population start feeling again that I'm not a fool, and if I'm renting, I'm wasting my money. I need to get a mortgage for 25 or 30 years instead of renting. So we have speeches that are previous to the crash, and the banks are already reacting on a largest economic and financial restructuring, which is part of the financial problem, which is that banks, all those toxic assets that come from 2008 are transferred to vulture funds like Blaster that have a larger ability that bank to manage it and to have a political influence, because it's not the same to negotiate with a bank than with Blackstone, which is one of the international vulture funds that are more important, is the one that has most houses on the United States and internationally. So that antagonism is fruit of what they talk in the book, which is part of the commoditization of housing, and this hyper-commoditization is being developed a lot more in the last few years, especially since 2013, where household pricing increases in the whole of Europe because of international context, low interest rate. So for international oligarchies, interest rate close to zero is a lot more profitable. They would lose money if it's on the bank, so what they are doing is they're investing in real estate. David talks about it in the book, but the United Nations is saying that. They're saying there is a problem. International oligarchies are using real estate sector to park the money at the international level. All of that, together with the crisis of the financial markets, debt, exchange programs from the European Union, and they're injecting 60,000 million euros on debt markets in the European Union, and those markets are less profitable, so real estate ends being, as compared with other markets, more profitable market. But we're talking about speculation. We're talking about people investing in this money on housing that are never going to live on those houses. They're never going to step on this country, but they're going to get profit from that. And the third point, I don't know how I'm doing on time. You have a couple of minutes. So the third element is the state role. That's quite clear in the book. But what happened in this country is from the manual, the bubble. After 2008, we had a number of policies to rescue the financial sector, but we were not imagining is that on parallel and in an invisible way, a lot of policies were going to be generated to generate a real estate bubble, so the state, the government, at a state, autonomous region, and municipal level will be positioned on the side of the ones controlling the sector, which are no longer the bank, but international vulture funds. We had Socimi's figure in 2008 by President Zapatero to revitalize the market, and that's a total failure. Between 2009 and 2012, there's no single Socimi. And that was going to be the investment vehicle, a speculation vehicle that was going to be used by international vulture funds for real estate in Spain, and that's the main cause of this bubble. There's not a single Socimi in this country. We get 2012, Mariano Rajoy's government reforms Socimi's law, and the most important thing with those reforms is that vulture funds stop paying taxes. After that, new laws of Socimi classes with urban rents. So we have a lot of privilege with international vulture funds, and they cross with the citizens. And rent increases from 2013 and 2016, and they reform the urban rent law with no net, because the market was increasing more and more, and rent was getting less of our income. They reformed the law, changed the law in an artificial way. They were generating a situation where vulture funds were no longer going to pay taxes in these countries. They're going to have a 20% of their profitability was going to be an artificial profitability politically created. Now we only had real estate bubbles that state from expectation mechanisms, the thing of supply and demand. There's no household for housing for so many people, and we have 1/3 of all empty houses are in Spain. So the demand is artificial because it's because of international investment, not because of our economy. It's not real process, it's bubble process. That's why Madrid and Barcelona have increased 40 and 50% the rent price in Madrid and Barcelona, and they are dissociated from the reality. So after those reforms, they need to have international vulture funds, the most important one, investing in this country, so we had confidence and to get more investment in the country. And that's what was from a handbook. So we reform both laws. We get the new law on 2013, and 1 month after that, the same party that changed the law at municipal level from the Madrid municipality sells over 1,800 public housing to the largest international vulture fund. 2 weeks after one After that, they sell 2,500 houses to Sora and Goldman Sachs. So the signal for international market is not just we have intervened the market from the political point of view. When they ask right now, with the law changes, do we have to regulate? Don't we have to regulate? No, the real estate market is already politically regulated, and it's intervened politically regulated since 2013. We have that artificial profitability, and immediately by selling public housing, two of the most important international vulture funds make massive investments in this country. What happens after that? Prices that were falling from 2018 to 2013 start increasing because of the increases in Madrid and Barcelona, and they start in our country starts receiving mass investments on real estate. 2017, we have a record of international investment of real estate in Spain. 2018, Blaston has the largest private real estate operation in Spain, and he's the first owner of housing in Spain. 2018, there's a new record of Golden Visa. Golden Visa is something that they give you if you have not been in the country forever. You have the residence permit when you have invested over 500,000 euros in the country. So what we see is that we have that polarization, and we can talk about class struggle because we've seen representatives from the sector in 2018. Have you seen news that the market is being recovered? It's a very good moment to invest. But on the other side, we see that people are being put on the street. Population have it more and more difficult to get on to the end of the month. We have more and more eviction, and as David was saying, they have in the book that the crisis is the proper functioning of the real estate system. That is, the more profit there is for them, the more difficult they're going to be for the general population because of this antagonism, because of the between the social function and the speculative function. If you guarantee one of them, you don't guarantee the other one. Right now, the Spanish society is guaranteeing the right to speculate. In the book, when they talk that in New York, 45% of households are regulated, and only 25% of housing have market prices, and owners can set the price by themselves. In Spain, we're talking about 98% of the market. That is, in Spain, everyone who's renting in the last 5 years, potentially, we can decide anything. Administration, just because the owner of our house decides to do that, we can have an abusive increase, or we may have been evicted. So if 98% of the potential market can be done that, when there's an investment and a speculation cycle, then the bubble starts, which is what happened in Spain. I'm done. I'm going to talk about resistances, but I don't have more time, so maybe in the debate.
I think it's my turn now. First of all, two corrections that I would like to make, not for me, but for the department. I am a PhD. I have to say this because otherwise I will be scolded because I didn't mention it. And secondly, the name of the department, which is Urban Planning and Organization of the Territory. When I read the book, what I tried to see is what is the way you narrate, you tell the story, and what is the narrative here in Spain, and what could be the connection points or the divergent points, because I believe that each territory has its own particularities. But when I was thinking about this yesterday, what I was going to say today, I thought that I would start with something that is very it's very clear, and we need to leave this room here having this very clear in our mind. You said this earlier when you started. The problem of the housing is the problem of the cities that we have been building since the 19th century, and we cannot forget this. The struggle, the speculation, the wild speculation, the savage speculation is born in the 19th century, and it's very well connected with the process of expansion of Madrid city, of all the cities in Madrid, with all the great cities that have been created, and we have been fighting this since back then, and the results have been not very good so far. I believe that it's very important to say this, and it's very important to highlight this, because every time that we sit down to speak about housing, it looks like it's a new issue that has just come about in the last decade or in the last boom, and this is not true. This process is a very long-lasting problem, and I believe that we also need to acknowledge that we're not in the same point as we used to be. The struggles now are improving certain aspects, but obviously the structural battle, which is that what the book deals with, is still there, and it's still unresolved, and probably it's still without a solution. And I also would like to say something about this, which is that probably about the most positive aspects about the PA platform, aside from their day-to-day work, it's the fact that they have reminded us and that they have taken to the political stage and the media stage the issue of access to housing that we have not resolved yet. Regarding what happened in the real estate boom and what happened before, where we saw many professionals talking about that problem and many activists dealing with that problem. Since the PA platform was started, nobody here is not aware that there are a certain amount of people in this country that do not have the same perspective, and I think that we might find part of the solution of the problem if we ever can find it. I think that part of the solution lies there. The second thing that I wanted to say, connected with this thing that is so obvious that I just said, is that the problem and the risks that we are facing, that is also mentioned in the book, and that I found very gratifying to read in the book, is a proposal about the need that we have of understanding well why things are the way they are right now, that we really pull the thread to the root causes, to understand the endemic causes, so that we can resolve them. So the issues regarding housing have been growing for many years, as Javi said before. I would also like to present an idea that I don't know if I'll be able to express properly, which is that the decisions coming from the public administration or from the politicians regarding housing very often are have a certain amount of evil in them, and we are not capable of foreseeing in our crystal ball what is going to happen and how the solutions that we're bringing about what will the consequences of these be in the future. And it's something that I try to remind very often, is the rents being frozen after the civil war in Spain. One of the policies that all governments in Europe, no matter from which side they were, one of the policies that they presented was to freeze the rents, because at a time where a lot of houses were needed, what they lacked were speculative processes that were specific and that would expel the population living in the small housing park that we had. This brought about, as a consequence, many other problems that we are still dealing with today. One of the characteristics of the renting park in Madrid and in most of Spain is that the quality is lower than that of the ownership number of houses. The freezing of the rents prevented the population from being expelled from the cities, but also it had as a consequence the lack of motivation for the owners to invest in these properties, and this led to many of the tenants to leave these houses, and therefore these houses endure nowadays many issues, not only those that are related to the time where they were built, but also they have problems regarding to their conservation status and the quality of the materials used. We can always ask ourselves, where was the problem, in freezing the rent or not forcing the owners to maintain their properties appropriately? It's very hard to tell, but what I wanted to mention is that there are certain decisions that make sense at a given point, but in the short term, medium term, or long term will have certain consequences that will lead to certain urban processes that we cannot fully control, because all the processes that took place in the 1980s have a lot to do with that part of buildings, of houses from the past. And I'm not very sure that if we had a gentrification will back then, or if it was really something that was related to the fact that we cannot really understand the processes of the cities in their full complexity. So I think that maybe we, grabbing this idea of knowing where we come from, we need to stop and be patient when we try to understand the origin of the problem. At any rate, and just moving to the last point that I wanted to tell you about today, is that I wanted to say something is that the most interesting thing for me, aside from those that Javi has mentioned up until now, is that a housing problem is not a problem related to the number of housings, but the type of houses, the price, the where they are located, and the quality of the houses. So moving this toward the urban areas, which is where I would like to stand to tell you my perspective, we have another divergent point with regards to the previous period during the real estate boom. The housing and the urban policies aimed at expanding the cities towards the limitlessly. And from a few years back, I think we all agree, even the developers themselves, that the future in the cities is not expanding them towards the next region, the neighboring regions, but to intervene within the existing city, the refurbishing policies, the last land that we have and that are not developed, and their policies are even more dangerous because people are already living in the cities, and that process that we did not know where it started or where it ended, that it started maybe with the freezing of the rents, is going to be turned into our daily challenge, as we are seeing in places like in Argumosa and in other places around the city, in other neighborhoods in the city. And we should not forget this. The last point that I wanted to deal with today is very much connected with one of the bets mentioned in the book, that from a theoretical viewpoint I fully agree with. The book says that we need to decommodificate the housing, which this is something that can help us move out of this issue. And I think we have called this in many different ways, but I think the idea is to set some discipline in the housing issue and have the state as an agent, as an actor that is powerful enough to control the prices in the rents, for instance, from the most radical to the less radical perspective. Everyone has suggested this, but I think to me this is the main issue here, how to do this. Well, if I knew, if we knew, we would not be here talking to you. We would be commodifying the housing. As my suggestions, I would say that the state needs to be one of the actors. This is the Vienna example is mentioned very often. In Vienna, the government can actually intervene because it's one of the main owners of the buildings, and they have been developing their policy for over 50 years. The problem here is that the public administration has never been a real actor. They have promoted particular ownership, personal ownership, and they have been periods of great investments, but the investments have fled now, and we're facing a serious problem right now. I do not know how, even if we request more social houses, the administration can actually become another actor by the weight that they might have in order to solve the problem that we are facing. But there are two issues that I think that if we give them a twist, they could help us a lot in achieving the goal that we have set for ourselves. One of them has to do with the public investments that exists both the city and the housing, and how to control this investment. And the second one has to do with the social aspect of housing that Javi mentioned before. One of the things that I am worried about is the ability or inability that we have to control that both the public policies and the public investments do not end becoming an overvalue that is enjoyed by the vulture funds and the citizens themselves, because I believe that the importance of the emergence of several actors that were not in the real estate market is important. We cannot forget the history of our country and who owns the houses in this country, who are mainly small owners who have one or two houses. They have invested their own savings depending on what the tax policies recommended or advised at a given time. And so we have the financial system on the one hand, the vulture funds that we can easily or more easily fight against from the political stage. And then we have the other agent, who is the citizen, who have invested their own savings, because this is what was recommended from the public authorities. And with an example, I will try to explain better what I mean by this. When the town hall in Madrid, when the municipality in Madrid starts public works on a street, or when they decided that they will put the M30 underground to change the area around the Manzanares River, everyone had in mind that all these houses around the river would see an upraise in their prices. I do not know the figures, but you know that the owners from that area were very happy about several things, but also because their houses are more expensive now. So I'm not talking about the overvalue that could come from the refurbishment of cities that will obviously increase the value in the market of the house. I'm also talking about the improvements in the city that will lead to every little owner to understand that the value of the property has increased thanks to the investments that we have made, all of us. I think that I will finish with the social function and mentioning the main line of thought, which is with what I started. And it's that we will only move houses away from being commodities if we're all aware that housing is a problem of all of us, and that society, both the political, economic, and social powers, and even the small owners, if we all realize that this is the greatest challenges for cities nowadays. The social function of housing is included in our constitution, and it's probably one of the best tools that we might have. You are an owner. We acknowledge your right, but you are not entitled to do whatever you want with it. So let's acknowledge the territory in which we are living, and that houses need to be a base for every person to develop their life in the cities. And for this, we need to have everyone thinking and building from the same perspective.
Muchísimas gracias, Raquel.
Thank you very much, Raquel. Mercedes, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Thank you, David, for this book. It's wonderful that books are in the market, and if they deal with the housing issue, I think that's even a greater source of joy. The darkness, the opacity regarding figures and surveys around housing in this country is enormous. So we are very happy to have books and PhDs and academics like my colleagues here today who can tell us about this issue with numbers and with facts on the table. As activists of the platform called PA, we are crazy activists. Every day we have a crazy activism going on. We have to negotiate with vulture funds, with banks, to find out who's behind each thing. We go into the office, into the bank branches, we do scratches to people, and this is a very crazy action, and we have very little time to reflect and to read a book, and reading a book is an oasis in our lives that makes us think about things that we were starting to forget. For instance, David reminds us in his book that the housing for the workers in the plants was a very important way of keeping them under control by the fear of them losing their house. We should not forget this, or the demolition of the wrong, so to speak, neighborhoods, things that happened, for instance, in Gaza on the West Strip, is something that is happening nowadays, and the will to keep your house makes you work endlessly. As we say in Spain, you would work like a Chinese person in order to keep your house. That means we would work non-stop for 24 hours. I started reading this book being aware that this book deals with New York or London, and I was really transported, and I thought that the reality it tells really could be applied to our own country. In page 60, for instance, what he tells here, this reminded me of the project called Castellana Norte, north of the main avenue in Madrid, Paseo de la Castellana. Or in another page, he mentions, in page 62, he tells us about the son of the ministry in London, and we have a similar case here about a person who is the son of a famous politician and who has placed himself very well in a vulture fund. He tells us also that the lack or the worries about housing makes us sick, and the trauma related to eviction, the suicide rates we see every day in our offices, colleagues and friends who want to commit suicide, and this is the grandeur of these platforms who really welcome you and prevent you from taking such a radical action. It tells us also about families and the shelters, what they call resources in the city of Madrid. Shelters are only an emergency resource for people who come from the boats trying to cross the strait between Africa and Spain, but we cannot think that these are alternatives to real housing. In this book, they also tell us about the stress of not being able to pay our mortgage. And in 125, he tells us about the Chicago and the Stop Eviction movement there, where they talked about people without a home and homes without people. And here we say almost the same sentence. So in the book, from the beginning to the end, we can read the story of what's going on right now in Spain. There is not a single thing that makes us different from the things that he tells in the book. The only aspect that could be different is the investment funds. I don't know that if you know that a few years back, the Spanish National Bank told the investment funds, many banks had their own real estate businesses, the Santander Bank, etc., Aliceda, Anticipa, they were all the real estate divisions of these banks where we could get these, where we could get houses either rented or bought. Now, the National Bank told them that they had all these houses from all the families that you have evicted, and now you need to get rid of them because this is not your what you need to do is to make business with the commissions, and the banks, the Spanish banking system, started to follow this order with their classical lack of solidarity. They have applied so many abusive clauses in the mortgages that we signed so many years ago. They have cheated us for many years, and this banking system sells everything that the European Central Bank told them, and they sold these houses to 30,000 euros. You can never find a house for this price in the big cities or on the coastal areas. You see that they're underselling these thousands of houses to speculative investment funds that have that pay their taxes abroad, because they use tools such as the SOCIMIs, the real estate investment trusts, so that they don't pay taxes here in Spain. And all these big investment funds have landed in Spain, and not only in our country, in others as well, but they have arrived here to stay, to buy hundreds of thousands of houses. And now we are told that Spain is a country where we have a great number of small owners, but I hesitate to say that this is so anymore. I think that the big owners have come, and I would like to know more figures, but we are not told them. And I would like to know how this happened, how they were allowed, these investment funds were allowed to buy a product that is a basic need for people. How did we let these people, these investment funds, buy these commodities? We need to build a house, as David says in his book. We live in the neighborhoods. We want to make the city with the neighbors that we greet every day, with the family that we have around us. It's not only the place where we dwell. It's not the floors and the ceiling. It's the place where our kids have their toys. It's where we eat. The concept of housing goes beyond that, and we're letting all these investment trusts to prey on the Spanish market. Look at this ad that I found yesterday. It's called "The Best Investment for the Global Elites," as if we didn't know that globalization has completely failed, and that globalization is only the precarization of the workers around the world, not only ours, but of workers from all over the world. And they are talking here about the global elites. There are many solutions that I suppose that we will be talking about now. Some of them have been mentioned. There are so many things that we need to keep in mind here. For instance, we need thousands of tools. There's not one or two or three solutions that we should find. There are thousands of solutions that we need to undertake right now, because the situation right now is an emergency. This is nothing. What happened 10 years ago is nothing compared to what's going on right now. There are hundreds of families crying and suffering from this situation, and we still do not want to realize what's going on. And maybe it's worse still. Maybe we are realizing it, but we are being blindfolded voluntarily, so we don't see what's going on. So, in my opinion, we need to build massively social and public housing in this country. And I think this is one of the lines that we should follow in the future. I cannot believe that in the Nazi Germany, 100,000 houses were built in Germany every year. In Spain, in the 50s and the 60s last century, and in 2008, 6,800 houses were built, and in other countries 10,000 houses are being built every year. And now they tell us that we need 1.5 million of public houses that to tackle the emergency that we are enduring right now. And So what I believe is that we really need to undertake this massive building project. I do not care what the minister says. If he's telling me about such a little number, as he mentioned the other day, and he's talking about the near future, a few hundred houses a year, that's not enough. And we see the records of the past years in Spain. I think the budget for this year has 400 million euro to building houses that I think would really not, it's far from being enough. And also, we need to radically forbid the public and social housing until it's extremely old and it's falling down. And when it does, we need to check if it's cheaper to refurbish or rebuild. But this thing that they have done, selling the public houses, when we have the waiting lists that we have, it's incredible that they dare to do this. I don't know if you know Palos de la Frontera, an area in Madrid. There were massive queues of people trying to renew the requests for public housing, and you can see floods of people queuing for it. And also in another office called IVIMA, which is the Institute of the Housing in Madrid, they have recently changed the name, but what they have, people have requested that they resign. The full board of directors of this institute resigns because they not only they do nothing, but they're completely lacking the aptitudes to do anything to improve the situation. We need to improve the action of the social mediators. They disappeared with the crisis. We need to increase the number of social workers and the personnel dealing with people having problems with their housing. They really cannot work more, and they're treating people very poorly because they're really overwhelmed with the amount of work that they have. Also, we would ask for a regulation for the investment funds. This is lacking a regulation, and in other countries like Belgium, there are laws that regulate the profits that the vulture funds can make in Belgium with the public debt. And here we should do it with the private debt. We need to regulate their profits and do what, like some courts have done. If you have bought a house at 25,000 euros, you can only sell it at 26,000 euros. For instance, 1,000 euros is already a profit, but if you bought a house at 25,000 euros, you cannot sell it at 200,000 euros. We're already at that stage again. We should not allow this to happen. We need investment funds to pay their taxes in Spain. They are earning so many millions and paying their taxes elsewhere. And when they do not pay their taxes here, they're getting the money that we might use here for public investments. And just to remind you that other countries have recovered the investments that they made in the banking system. London has recovered to 23,800 million euros in the investment that they made. ING has given Holland back 10,000 million that they used from the public funds. 20,000 millions were recovered elsewhere, and the Bank of Spain has estimated that in Spain we will not recover 60,000 million euros that we have invested in there to recover the banks. Bankia, that is a public bank, a nationalized bank, even though the board of directors refused to admit this, we have made them recover, and we have launched them again, and they do not have any social or public housing on the market. They have given 25 houses to the region of Madrid, and that's all in the past 3 years. We have been asking them for this information for 3 years, and they have acknowledged finally that it was only 25. Thank you very much.
David, no sé si te...
David Would you like to gather some of the things that have been mentioned in this panel, or would you like me to start?
Yeah, why don't we start discussing and involving the audience as well?
Bueno,
There's one question that I would like to ask you in order to open the debate, and it's related to the role of the state as an actor that you have all highlighted. It looks like it used to be common that the state has disappeared and it's the market that is regulating everything, and that's established the order of things, and the state is blurred and not participating in the public discourse. It's just like a reminiscence from the past that doesn't play a role. And in the book you say that the state cannot move away from the real estate markets because it's one of the institutions that is part of it. And I think that both in all your presentations, the state in the neoliberal system, far from disappearing, is a clear actor and a component of the market. It's the agent that we look up to, and the public policies regarding housing is the place that it's a reference. And I would like to ask you, therefore, on the one hand, how to give more visibility to this role of the state and to return this role to it, since now that the official discourse seems to move away from it, and how can we articulate this, including one of the agents that is so important and has such an active role in the making houses a commodity?
Yeah, maybe I'll start. Thanks for that. So I'm just going to take this out so I don't hear myself speaking. Yeah, I think it's a really important point to realize that the state will always be involved in housing, and there's no way for it not to be. The question is, what is it doing? And I think just framing the issue in that sense is already helpful, because certainly in the US and the UK, the two cases that I know the best, there's a lot of debate about sort of how involved in housing should the state be, and that's not really the right question. I mean, it's what is the state doing, and also what kind of state, because as you've all said, with a highly neoliberalized state, it's intervening, but it is intervening in order to make housing more of a commodity and more of an object of speculation and less an instrument for redistribution. So it's certainly partly a matter of sort of framing this question the right way. We talk a bit in the book about housing researchers in New York who stress the point that, in a sense, all housing is public housing, and this is very directly true in the U.S. I mean, there's sort of municipally built or housing that's been built by the national government that is called public housing, but even the sort of iconic suburban landscapes of the U.S. with single-family homes sitting on individual plots of land were directly subsidized through their mortgages by the government. And so when we start thinking of it that way, it really is a matter of sort of fairness. Why is the government spending so much money in order to aid fairly wealthy middle-class suburban homeowners? And if you look at the amount of money that's spent subsidizing expensive privately controlled homes, it absolutely dwarfs any sort of spending on social housing. So it is, I mean, to some extent, this is something that people just aren't aware about. One of the things that a lot of us have been discussing, and what the book discusses as well, is the role of ideology in housing, and how people generally don't see the housing system as a whole, and they don't really accurately understand the role of the state. But I mean, it's also clear that there is a radical disconnect between people's needs and state responses, and there's just a democratic deficit, and we're seeing this as well. I mean, one of the pernicious effects of financialization is that elites are sort of protected against the consequences of their actions, and states are in various ways protected against sort of popular mobilization. So, I mean, I guess the challenge then is sort of what are the ways to mobilize that are most effective now?
I would like to answer as well. I think that, to me, the state needs to be there, but from a position that I think we all agree on here in this panel, if we do not create a different agent, I cannot think of any other agent to mediate and help in the decommodization of the housing. And the state needs to be there, and they need to have a budget for it. One thing that I don't think I mentioned before is that the state has never been a relevant agent because the budget for housing has never been important, has never been significant, and it's impossible to carry out policies for the housing if you lack the budget. So we do need housing policies, and we also need to relax a bit state, region, and town hall. The example of Madrid is one of the worst in Spain, but if we move towards other regions, they're probably doing better. They have better tools. They're opening different paths. This does not mean that they ended the problem of housing, but they're exploring new paths. And I think that we are in the worst possible places because we have the biggest city of Spain with the government of the Partido Popular, the right-wing political party, for decades. And I think despite these facts, the state needs to be there. I tend to repeat myself with this, but I think that part of the problem with the housing policies and the role of the state in this country is the double goal that they wanted to achieve with the policies that they were developing. And this is written down in all the legal texts, in all the housing plans from the Franco times up until now. The first goal for the housing policies is to ensure the access for housing to the whole of the population, and the second goal is to promote the building as a economic driver of the country. These two goals are opposing goals, and this has led to the commodization of the housing. And if we want to go back, we need to reflect on why did we do this wrongly and how we could refocus it. But I don't think it's an option that the state is in this market, that it has to be, and with a more radical and present role.
Bueno, yo lo de desmercantil.
When it comes about turning housing away from being a commodity, of course, I also agree with that. But in Spain, I find that very difficult. If you remember, in the 1980s, the state has paid us for decommissioning the industry, for removing the cows from the north of Spain and producing less milk, for pulling the olive trees off the ground and produce less olives and olive oil. So what are the goals of Spain? What is our industry? It's building and tourism. If we start with thinking about this is a terrible situation, and we need to think about this topic. Maybe we need to really build public houses that we do not have at this time in order to reach the French or the Austrian standards, where there is a gap of 20–30%. We are missing houses. And Spain builds a lot in order to drive the economy, but let's build more. Any other elements to any other solution that we can think of? The cooperatives, the leaving the empty houses in the market, putting them back in the market, or finding the luxury flats that are underused. These are wonderful ideas. all of these action plans I can subscribe. But let's start building, because the building techniques are really incredible. Houses are built very quickly, very well, with great materials. There's a lot of land that is underused, and since people need a house urgently, this is something that we should take into account. Obviously, taking into account the urban planners and all these people who really improve the cities, and all these terrible bars and terrible areas that we see around certain areas of Madrid city. But to be honest, I think that Spain is devoting a great amount of its economy to building, to construction and tourism, and I think that we need to profit from this, at least so that people stop suffering from the housing issue.
Yo creo que también ahora hay una gran oportunidad.
I believe that right now there's a big opportunity due to the context, that population's reaction, the presence and the media and political agenda, because we reacted a lot sooner than in the previous cycle. So population by now is saying, okay, so we saw this before, and they are enraged. So there are a lot of debates on the type of regulation that needs to happen. There are many news in the media that vulture funds are tax havens in this country. So that's kind of a point of view that is more and more known. And even that it has been voted that left-wing parties voted against the change of a law less of a month ago that theoretically was going to guarantee right to housing, and these left-wing parties voted against because it was totally insufficient, and somehow it would continue speculation policies that the Popular Party had approved before. So the population knows this more or less, and one of the things of Spain living through a real estate cycle, not just as Mercedes was saying that just the economic part, but the political part at all different levels depends on the real estate speculation cycle. So for this to be able to work for 30 years, since 1985, one of the things is that there is no information, there are no statistics, and they're one of the things that happens on our real estate market. So suddenly last year, Barcelona City Hall decided on their quarterly increase if they were in favor or against regulating rent, and nearly 80% said that they were in favor. So although there are people who own the house and they pay the mortgage, and some of them expect to have more of a bubble for a revalue, but the general feeling is that it has to be limit of the speculation on housing. And we see it with surveys like that one, but those surveys doesn't happen because no one wants them to happen. And the law changes that wanted had a backup of over 1.5 million signatures. And it has one of the most important backup from the country. So population is ready, but how can we change that feeling on a political movement that can really change the political parties? Because there are two political parties. The Popular Party are totally aligned with vulture funds and speculation. So the proposal before housing is more bubble, more construction, more law for the land, more housing and all that. And the Socialist Party, once they get to the government after voting at the autonomous region level laws to guarantee housing, they have a different landscape. Vulture funds and the bankers saying that, and you cannot give your house back for the money you own for the mortgage. So there's like a going back on the type of policy from the Socialist Party, and what they're doing at the state level is different from the autonomous region part level. But there are answers. PAM managed to get a lot of these systems, and 1/3 of the empty housing is in Spain. So as when they were saying it's an ideological thing, of course the Popular Party was saying it's impossible to touch empty housing through tax breaks. Socialist Party says that, but in Spain you can do that and you can force it. Why do you have to have millions of empty houses that are owned by banks when Article 33 of the Spanish Constitution that has right of ownership says the right of ownership in this country is subject to the social part? So with the autonomous region laws that were proven that you can expropriate house when they're empty for more than 2 years, and you can get them from banks and vulture funds. They took it from the Constitutional Court in February, March, September, October in Navarra, Catalonia, and all different Spanish regions. The Constitutional Court said that it was within the Constitution to expropriate empty houses when they were empty for more than 2 years. And that happens in nearly all countries. You have 2,500 euros fines in Holland if you have an empty house, but not here, because you cannot touch the right to speculation, or antagonism between social and speculation. And speculation is very much protected. And you don't defend the right of housing. And you can see that on all the laws that were approved. As Raquel was saying, some autonomous regions were approving autonomous region laws in that sense.
Vimos en estos momentos finales de la...
We are opening the debate to the audience. Hello?
Yes, it seems a simple problem, so I'm going to make it more complex. Where do you think we can have an alliance from the social and political point of view that can change real estate capitalism path in Spain and other countries, of course, but to state yet in Spain, and had a real intense component on the real estate from exchanges and Franco's policies and so many things? Where can we have an alliance that can change the rules of the game, not just on key actors, new actors, let's say, vulture funds and so on, but just the enormous momentum of having thousands and thousands of new owners who are not allies in that fight? How do you take them to share that change? And to simplify, we add the demographic component. What happens with that? Because I don't know if you have that, if you bear that in mind, you diagnose it, and I think it's important. And the detail of the weather, climate, the climate change, that they're going to change everything. So with what is being proposed in the US, the Green Social Agreement, that could be in that construction fever, which is different, but that crashes and is the same contradictions as the panel. It crosses with the fact that we have tons of empty houses. So maybe the answer is rehabilitation, reform, more than massive reform, more than construction. So I want to leave it like that because it seems to be simple. So let's have more variables.
Any other question so we can gather several together? If nobody wants to join in, I will step right into the puddle myself. I think that your question is very difficult. I will start by the end, the empty houses. I have talked a lot about the empty houses, but after what happens in Barcelona, my conclusion is that, I don't know if Mercedes or somebody else said it, but what we really need to do is to be aware of what's happening in Barcelona. They decided to carry out a census about the empty houses to know the real figures. I do not know what were their base figures. They were maybe around 10% of the houses in 2011, but what they had realized is that the empty houses of these that we are all thinking about have a real need of a house, of housing, and so I'm going to put into the market the empty houses. This idea that we all had in mind does not exist in reality. So, as Mercedes said, we need to build public and social housing. Since yesterday, there's one house less empty that is empty because we carried out a social action for Vicente and his 3 kids who were on the street. We used one of these empty houses from the Santander Bank. We used it for them. But as you say, there are very few. I do not really know if there are many or just a few. We really do not have the figures, but we do need is to know what's going on. If we do not know the reality, it's very difficult to present or establish new policies. Regarding the social political alliances, how can we convince the vulture fans? We cannot convince them of anything, so we need to use other tools if we are brave enough. How can we convince the whole of our colleagues that this is happening, so that we are all aware that this is our problem? I think there are certain aspects that are easier to tackle than others. All of us have children or brothers or sisters or relatives who are struggling to have a house. So the reality forces us to understand things that are going on that we did not know before. And there are certain aspects that make us all understand which is the path of evil and which is the path of good, and understand that we are all moved by the taxing policies. And if there have been any tools or any ideas coming from the state that have redirected the population from one side to the other, it's one of the things has been the tax policy, I think.
I think it's quite a powerful political issue potentially, and there really could be a very strong alliance created around housing issues. I mean, part of the problem, again, is the sort of inequality within housing systems. And so working class tenants or public tenants versus private tenants, or middle class households versus poor households. There are a lot of divisions that obviously prevent people from mobilizing together. And, you know, part of the challenge then is finding a perspective from which to articulate a broad project that people would all sign up for. And as I think we've all been saying, we're not starting from nothing. Most people would agree that there's something to the idea of a right to housing, and the idea of home still carries real ethical and symbolic significance for a lot of people. So I think there's some sort of basis for that. But it's also, I think there's a broader current that can be mobilized around, that is connected to housing, which is the larger sense that life is just much more precarious and difficult than it needs to be. And this larger sense that the future that people used to feel that they could depend upon is not really there any longer. I mean, I think there's a way to tie together the different sorts of precarity and instability that different sorts of households experience. I mean, it's not, obviously middle-class households are living less precarious lives than working class and poor households, but there's still some sense of precarity, of struggling to try to make ends meet, whether it's in the form of caring for children or caring for older relatives, or just the daily commute. I mean, there's a feminist philosopher, Nancy Fraser, who writes about the crisis of care in contemporary cities, and I think this is something that is real for a lot of households, and that is not only a specific issue, and it's also something that is shaping the political economy of cities in a broader way. I think the more unequal cities become, to some extent, the more this becomes a drag on the very capitalist political economies that are creating the inequality in the first place. I mean, to a large extent, the sort of consequences of an unequal and highly competitive housing system, they're being largely experienced by working class and poor households. But there's also a sense in which middle class lives and even corporate profitability is being cut into by these very processes of financialization. So I think it is, to some extent, a matter of formulating all this and getting people to understand that, I mean, as much as there very clearly are some people benefiting from the housing problem, it's also shaping a lot of issues in ways that I think people don't even necessarily understand.
Hola, quería hacer una pregunta.
Hello, I would like to ask a question. When you look at the population pyramid in Spain and other countries, you see that in 10, 15 years, the baby boom cohorts after the Second World War are going to start to die. and there's a lot less people behind them of the ones who already own housing and will die. So what will happen with all that houses that we will not be able to do anything with them? What will politicians do? Or the powers that have commodified this to maintain that scarcity, because those houses will be there. Will they tear them down? What will they do so that housing is not available and prices don't drop? Because all those houses that are owned by people, those people would die and there will be no theoretical buyers behind them, because the population pyramid is more of a cylinder, or even worse. So I would like to know what you think about it. What will they try and do so that doesn't go to the market and prices don't drop?
Nowadays, people have a great need, and what they have done is raising the renting prices. People are living in anguish because they cannot survive with the income that the household incomes. I would not like to leave it here today if I do not, without helping people understand that the situation is that nobody's coming to help us. If the elderly do have a very low pension, they cannot pay for that. If the taxi drivers are on the street, this is also our fight, because it's the investment funds who are trying to precarize their situation. It's not because you cannot order a taxi through your app in your mobile. It's because the investment funds are also entering the taxi market, and they want to make never-ending profits. I was talking with a driver yesterday, and I was forced to use an Uber car, and I was talking to the driver yesterday, and I come to the conclusion that the situation that the taxi drivers are enduring is also our problem, and housing is our problem. I would like to ask you all, who has been here to try and prevent an eviction here in the community of Madrid, in the region of Madrid, or somewhere, or at some point in their lives? 2, 3 people. We are 35 people here today, and evictions are our problem, and this is a very low number of people. The fact that they're evicting your neighbor next door today is our problem, because they're emptying your building as a whole, and they will come to our building next. We have seen them emptying in 15 days full buildings, and the family who doesn't know the tenants, trade unions, or the power platform, who they don't know us, and they live anxiously, and they think that it's their problem, that they could not afford to keep a house for which they paid 500 or 800 euro, and they also have to pay for the moving that costs them money that they have not saved. And these are our neighbors living next door to us. So let's start fighting. Let's take the streets. In France, they have been for 12 Saturdays in a row, 140 people. The yellow vests have had many injuries. They have lost eyes. They have suffered injuries in their arms and hands, and they still keep fighting. They're claiming that they do not make ends meet anymore. And what's going on here in this country? We are not making ends meet either with our lousy salaries. And so I would call you all to join any of the fights on the street so we can achieve our goals. A journalist was asking me today if there were any evictions today, journalists working here for Fundación Telefónica, and I was shocked. Do you think that there are no more evictions in Spain anymore? Last year there were 70,000 families evicted from their houses. Imagine all the silent evictions that do not go to court, to any judicial procedures, because this person who has no money to fight it back will not go take his case to the court. And so this is a silent eviction, and this is happening. So please take the streets, please move. regarding the question, or if you want to make a final comment, I would like to ask you for brevity.
Yeah, so answer what was said before. According to the book, the real estate market is not organized according to the needs or wills from the population, but economic interest, and now the financial interest, that is what says where it's going to be built, what type of housing, how much it's going to cost, and etc. So its interests are totally far away of reproductive or vital interests from the population. So according to all of those socio-demographical suppositions, it will depend on financial interest. In the book, it talks a lot about the new trend to build luxury houses where no one is going to live, but money is going to be parked there and houses are going to be revalued. It doesn't matter that there are empty houses if that is going to be revalued as an asset. Going back to what was before, there are just a few figures about the Spanish real estate market, but what we have is 2011 census that says that in Madrid there is 260,000 empty houses, and in the capital of Madrid 153,000. As is one of the few figures we have in Barcelona due to the very distribution of the city is different. They did the same census, but let's calculate that the list half, because according to the same Institute of Statistics in Spain, half of them could be inhabitable. But if there is no empty houses, why is that resistance to prepare any type of policy that is not a tax policy that will make those empty houses be mobilized, and why the Popular Party has taken that to the Constitutional Court if there's no empty houses in Spain? And I link that with the small owners, which is another myth, I believe, in Spain. Society and population access to house as an owner due to the previous bubble. But the rent market is not as clear because there are no figures that is articulated on population. So the myth, and it's what is always said, that cannot be regulated because it's working class, and according to the work they bought, how many houses can the working class, middle class buy? A couple of doctors. How many houses can they buy if they have not inherited? How many houses can they accumulate? 10 in Madrid? I think not. So in Barcelona, they did another study, and for the first time they saw that 35% of the market is controlled by legal entities. So no private person, no private people. And the other 65%, like in the Balearic Island, they forced 45 individuals how to mobilize 800-something empty houses as social rent. 45 people with 859 houses. Those are not just private people. From the legal point of view, they're presented, but Pa mentioned after 10 houses, you were not an individual, although the law will recognize you as such. And I think it's quite good from PAP according to 5 houses that you own. So we don't have the figure, we don't have the information, but I think it's a myth. And as far as we don't have information, this information I gave you is a bit of a contradiction to the myth, because this is what sector representatives and politicians governing for the speculation sector use to say that it cannot be taught because poor working class, that they work hard to get those houses to get to the end of the month. According to the analysis that you were saying, 80% of the population in Barcelona, probably most of them are household owners, want the rent to be regulated, even if their houses are not revalued so much. So from the 70s to 2008, it doesn't matter your salary, that we tag the working, we tag the well-being, because we're going to give you a mortgage so you can get a house that would allow you to increase your assets. This myth has been broken now and people don't believe anymore.
I don't know about sort of specific demographic predictions, but it is definitely the case that many cities have started destroying housing in order to maintain the profitability of housing markets. I mean, in many countries, I mean, states, especially the more that private home ownership becomes established as the sort of only legitimate key to stability for states that are destroying pensions and destroying other forms of social security, they see it as their imperative to keep the price of housing as expensive as possible. And they might still say things like, well, we need to have affordable housing, or we need to do something about the cost of housing. But at the same time, these same states are doing whatever they can to keep housing extremely expensive. And so it is certainly beyond, not beyond the realm of possibility that that cities and national governments would be in the business of destroying housing, or that real estate wouldn't be encouraging it. I mean, I think fundamentally we have to see that contemporary financialized real estate companies, they're not in the business of producing houses. They're in the business of producing profit using houses. So if that means destroying houses, they will destroy houses. If it means building houses that will never be inhabited, they'll do that. It's also, I think, it's not only a case of sort of supply and demand being the only important things here. I mean, obviously they matter, but it's also distribution of housing supply as well. So if it is possible to sort of maintain the profitability of housing, even if there's more housing than is needed, then that may not sort of be a problem for the people who dominate the housing system. So I don't know. I mean, I think the bigger question is how states are going to try to democratize housing in the future. I mean, irrespective of sort of demographic change, and irrespective of the number of housing. I mean, the number of houses. The bigger question is how is it distributed? Who's controlling it? What purposes is the housing system militating for?
A ver, dos cuestiones.
Two things to try and answer your question. First, there are some topics that are being talked about, and for instance, the law, the 2013 law about the rents was established, was passed, and there are other things that we can see that might show the trends of the state that has decided that housing is a matter that we need to talk about, and that the market is trying to self-regulate itself, and that's the perspective of the state, and they're hinting it as about how to keep making a profit from the real estate market, and this connected with the object that most of the population uses every day, and this has to do with refurbishing, and this has to do with power, and there have been many modifications that are being implemented since then that are connected to this. When I was telling you before that one of the risks that I see is that we are playing the game in the existing cities and not in the outskirts, has a lot to do with this, and I think that refurbishing is a whole world and it has an important role to play. And on the second hand, talking about the data that we have of the ownership, the data from 2001, we told us who was the owner of the houses, and the relationship between the natural and the legal persons was ridiculous. It was below 5%, and I think that clearly the presence and the power of vulture funds and certain actors that are acquiring real estate, and the old owner, the traditional owner, which is what they're trying to appeal with regional laws when they talk about the great owner or the great holder. When you talk, these represent about 25 to 35%, and I think there's a great amount of houses that are still in the hands of the small owners, and I believe that we need to approach this from different perspectives, not because I believe that these are working class, but because I think that these are two different agents, and one ways of balancing what is going on is understanding the complexity of the actors and maybe create alliances with this part that you would never establish an alliance with. And I think it's not helpful to forget that the structure of the ownership is this one, and it might be an opportunity or not, but I don't think it is very helpful. Even though we know who the enemy is, it's not helping us to forget that they are still there. In the last pages of your book, Mr. Maiden and Marcus say that if the housing needs to represent something as a movement against the financialization, commoditization, and the right to housing is a path, not the solution. The only solution is to fight so that this right becomes a reality. These are the last words in the book, and I would like to close today this session as well. Thank you. Thank you very much.